200 years ago. Over 200 years ago. You believe that?
No.
Of course you don't. It was written 200 years ago by a guy named Lawrence Tribble. He wrote it in the middle of a great awakening in the religious life of the United States. It was in a direct response to the suffering and the chaos that was going on around him. And somehow, in the midst of all of this, his life was transformed. Something awakened inside of him. Something spurred this action, and he didn't know what else to do, so he wrote it down because he was awakened. And he knew that if he could share his story with somebody else, they would be awakened. And then they could continue to share this powerful story. This God thing, guys, this God thing, it's contagious. It's contagious. And we try our best, don't we? We try our best not to be affected by it, right? We have our cell phones out 24/7, texting, tweeting, Facebooking, whatever. I got a couple alerts from Facebook already about, that was such a great interview. Somebody posted on Facebook. That was quick response time. That's quick. But we have stuff in front of us constantly. Why? Because we are so desperately afraid to be courageous. Right? Because if we hide behind our iPads and our computers and our favorite TV shows, if we hide behind this front we put up, then we don't have to be courageous. Right? That's why we do it. We might not know that. We might not say that. But did you know that being courageous, courage, is the birthplace of innovation, reformation? Courage is the birthplace of radical community. And you know what makes courage possible? You know what it means to be courageous? It means to be vulnerable with one another. And how vulnerable can we be if we're on our phones 24/7 and we're like, hey, did you see this on Facebook? I'm sitting right next to you, but did you see this? Here, look it up on your phone and we can talk about it. We don't want to be vulnerable with one another, right? That's scary. If I tell you that I'm insecure and afraid of the way I look, if I look you in the eyes and I say, I love you, I see you, that makes me uncomfortable. It makes me begin to cry a little bit. And I don't want to be vulnerable because then I just might get made fun of. I just might be pushed out to the side. And so why would I be courageous? Why would I be vulnerable when I know what happens to people who do that? But the thing is, nothing happens in this world if we don't dare step out. Anybody know what the most common phrase in the entire scriptures is? The most common phrase. Do not be afraid. More than I love you, more than you're a good person, more than do this or do that. The number one most common phrase in this book I hold in my hand is do not be afraid. You want to know what the second most common phrase is? Fear not. I think there's a message in here, right? About not being afraid. About being willing to put down our cell phones and our iPads and to look each other in the eyes. I dare say be courageous and be vulnerable and look each other in the eyes and say, I love you. I love you so much that you have forever changed my life. This happens a number of times in the Bible. There's this guy named Moses. Ever heard of him? Yeah, you heard of Moses? Well, Moses did one thing. And this one thing, if Moses wouldn't have done it, you wouldn't know who Moses was. But Moses, being the good person that he was, probably only because he wanted to impress his father-in-law. We all know how that goes. I want to impress mine. So I do whatever my father-in-law asks. He says, do something, and I'm like, yes, sir, I'll do it right away. You can ask him. Anyway, Moses, his father-in-law gives him his sheep, and he says, Moses, I need you to watch my sheep for me. He says, tend my flock. I got to go off and do some other stuff. So Moses had done this a number of times. He was a shepherd. He knew what he was doing. So Moses decided that he had to take these sheep to a new pasture. And so he took the sheep from one pasture and he led them to another pasture, something that he had done a number of times. In fact, if you've ever seen the way a sheep herder works, there's often pre-made trails carved out of hills where the sheep always run and always go when they're moving them from pasture to pasture. So Moses takes these sheep and he takes them and he's walking them up to this other pasture, something he's done time and time again. But this time, Moses stops because he sees a burning bush. Now, this bush was not in front of Moses. He didn't have to stop and recognize it to go around it, but it says that Moses turned to the side and saw the bush. He stopped from his routine, something he had done always, a ton of times. He stopped and he turned to the side and he saw the burning bush. You can imagine his excitement. See, the scriptures say that God had sent an angel to inhabit this bush. But once God saw that Moses turned to the side, God kicked the angel out, and God inhabited the bush, right? And so Moses gets really excited, and he starts to walk toward the bush, and the bush calls out to him. God calls out, Moses, Moses, don't come any closer. And so Moses stops, he freezes, and he says, here I am, Lord. And then God says to him, he says, Moses, take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. And so Moses takes off his sandals, he pushes them to the side. And the rest is history, right? Do you know what happens after he begins to talk with God in the bush? God begins to say, I see all this suffering in the world. I see all the pain in the world. And Moses, you've got to do something about it. In fact, God challenges Moses to be courageous, to be who he has been called to become, to be who God had created him to become. Moses, this ordinary sheep farming guy walking the same path he's walked over and over again, stops because he sees God is up to something in his midst, so he stops and he begins to look. But how about us in our own life, right? We take the same path to school week in and week out, right? Every morning we probably have the same routine. We do the same stuff over and over again. On Sunday when we go to church, we drive the same route. We always drive to go to church. And probably most of us sit in the same pew we always sit in because we get stuck in our rut. We're afraid to be vulnerable. And so we drive by every burning bush we can think of. We don't turn to the side. We don't stop and recognize God in our midst. But let me tell you something, folks. God is up to something. God is up to something. My wife and I, we were pastors in Southern California and LA for a couple of years. And one day, we only had one car. And so one day I had to go up to LA for some work. And so she was going to have to walk to work. We only lived about an hour from the congregation where we pastor, or an hour. We only lived about a mile from the congregation. It'd be miserable if it was an hour. That'd be a long walk. So if you've ever been to LA, it takes forever to go to LA. Even though it's only about 30 minutes away, if you go to LA, it's a day trip. Traffic is a nightmare, so you're there all day. So I was there all day. So Katie was going to have to walk to work and walk home from work. And on my way home, my phone rang, and Katie said, guess what? You'll never guess what happened today. And I said, yeah, I won't guess. I wasn't with you. So how am I supposed to guess? Ba-doom-tsh. These are the jokes, folks. So I said, I don't know. Tell me what happened. She said, Zach, I met a man today on the street. I know. I thought the same thing. What are you talking about? She clarified. Said, no. I met a man on the street. Then she continued and she said, I met Jesus on the street today. And I said, well, you got to tell me about it. So she began to tell me this story about as she was walking home, because I wasn't with her. If I was with her, we would have just jaywalked. But being the rule follower she is, she walked up to the crosswalk of the street and waited for the light to change. And so she waited, and as she was waiting, she noticed this guy behind her. And being the polite, nice person that she is, she looked at him, they smiled, and everything was fine. And she couldn't help but notice that something was happening. She began to feel stirrings. And so they exchanged the pleasantries that we always do of, how are you doing? I'm fine. Are you having a good day? Yeah. And the light turned, they crossed the street, and as they crossed the street, this man said to her, excuse me, would you mind changing my socks? See, Charlie is in a wheelchair because Charlie, when he was a young boy living in India, had his joints frozen by a doctor. And so he can't move his arms and legs quite right, so he has a power chair that he gets around Orange County, California in. And as they crossed the street, he said to her, would you mind and change my socks? See, Charlie wears compression socks. And I don't know if you've ever seen compression socks or if you've ever changed them, but they're incredibly hard to change. These aren't like regular socks where you just slip them off and you slip them on. These things suck onto your leg, and you've got to put back muscle into it and really get going to get these socks on. And so in the middle of Orange County, Katie got onto her knees on the sidewalk and began to change his socks. And they began to talk. They began to learn more about each other. They learned that Katie, with World Service Corps, had spent time in the village where Charlie grew up and lived. And so they began to talk about India and all the different experiences they've had. And they began to form a relationship. And Katie, being my wonderful wife that she is, she gave him my phone number because you can never call Katie. She never answers her phone. So she gives people my phone number so that when they call, someone will answer the phone. She'll tell you that's not true, but I promise that is the total truth. And so I got home that night, and the next day, Charlie called. He said, hey, Zach, it's me, Charlie. Your wife told me all about you. I'll meet you up at the church. I'll be there in 10 minutes. So, well, Charlie, I'm not at the church, so it won't be 10 minutes. Yeah, okay, well, I'll meet you at the church in 10 minutes, so I'll see you there. No, Charlie, I'm not at the church, so I'll meet you in 10 minutes at the church. Okay, Charlie, I'll be there in 10 minutes. So I went up to the church. What are you going to do, right? He's very insistent. I get to the church, and you would have thought that Charlie and I had been best friends for years. He began to share his heart with me. Remember a couple nights ago when Scott Murphy talked and he shared about courage a little bit, and he said, courage comes from the Latin word cur, which means to share one's full story of their heart. To share one's full story of their heart. Charlie is naturally courageous because he does not know someone that he does not want to share the story of his heart with. And so we began to form this relationship, and next thing you know, we're going out to lunch together, we're going to dinner together. He's inviting us to his house. He needs help with different things. And Charlie began to come to church week in and week out because while Katie was with him, she had informed him, hey, we're with the church just down the street. If you ever need anything, if you ever need your socks changed, come by and we'll change your socks for you. So we began this relationship. A few months later, Charlie invited us to his house for his birthday party. And this was the craziest room I've ever been in. It was incredibly diverse. There was only about 30 of us, but there were old people there and young people. One guy was like 102 years old. Seriously. Old. Older than my grandparents. Old. Just kidding. And then there were, white people there, Indian people there, Hispanic people there. This room was incredibly diverse. And we were all wondering, how did we get into this room? How did we get to this place? And so one lady said, as we were, just sharing in a circle and eating cake and ice cream, she said, why don't we go around the circle and share about how we know Charlie? Because this was an incredibly diverse room. And so we stopped and we began to go around the circle. And the first guy said, well, I was walking home from the grocery store one day and Charlie ran into me on the street and said, hey, would you mind and change my socks? So I stopped and I changed his socks. Gets to the next person, they said, well, I was on my way home from the gym one day and I bumped into Charlie on the street and he said, hey, excuse me, would you change my socks? So I stopped and I changed his socks. Gets to the next person, well, I'm Charlie's neighbor. One day I was out and I was working on my car and Charlie came outside and said, excuse me, would you come and change my socks? In every single person in that circle, the young and the old, had knelt down and changed Charlie's socks. Every single person. And it got to the end and we said, Charlie, what's going on? How can this be? I mean, this is a little strange. It's a little strange. It's true. And Charlie said, here's the thing. First, if I don't ask for help, I don't get any help. I have to change my socks. So if I don't ask for help, I don't get any help. And then he said, I'm a Christian. I believe in the love and the goodness of people. And this room of people got a little bit closer. We formed community of Christ in that room of people that had stopped in the midst of their busy lives, knelt down, and changed Charlie's socks. Well, over the course of the next few months, Charlie continued to come to church, and we continued to form a deeper and deeper relationship with him. And it came to summertime, and you know how summer is, right? We've got 100 million youth camps. We're gone 24/7, running. And when we got home from spec, Charlie called Katie and said, hey, I want to talk. And at this point, we had found out that we were going to be moving to Ohio from LA, and so we only had about a month left with the congregation. This congregation we had spent hours and hours loving. And Charlie called Katie and he said, here's the thing, Katie, I want to be baptized. I want to be baptized into the community of Christ. And so, August 27th, our very last Sunday in Orange Community of Christ, Katie and I both waded into the waters of baptism with Charlie. I held him in my arms as we walked down into the water. Katie placed her hands on him, and we baptized him into community of Christ. Why is this so powerful? Because Katie could have walked the same route home she's always walked, but she didn't. She stopped and turned aside and recognized God in her midst. She put her cell phone in her pocket and she knelt in front of everybody in Orange, California, and changed a stranger's socks. You think that takes courage? Does it take vulnerability to stop and turn aside to see what God is already doing in our lives? You may sit here tonight and you may think, God does not speak to me that way. God doesn't work in my life that way. You're wrong. You're dead wrong. God is moving in your heart. The question is, are you courageous enough to listen? Which is to say, are you willing to be vulnerable enough to stand in front of a crowd of people and cry because you feel the Spirit of God moving? Are you willing to walk down the hallways of your school, the same hallways you've walked day in and day out, and turn to the side and see the burning bush in your midst? Are you willing? Now hear me loud and clear. The world does not need any more complacent disciples of Jesus Christ. The world needs now courageous disciples that are willing to be radically vulnerable, that are willing to go into a grocery store or a restaurant or a school and proclaim what God is up to. We live in a world where kids your age die every day from hunger, where kids just like you sleep outside, in a world full of injustices and inequities. The world does not need one more complacent disciple. The world needs convicted, courageous, vulnerable, and radical disciples. Disciples that are willing to go through their everyday life and be disrupted and risk something new for the sake of the mission of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I refuse to be part of a complacent church. I want to be a part of a community of Christ that is so excited, that is so radically moved by the Spirit of God that they can't help but walk down the street and kneel down and say, "Do you need your socks changed?" That we get so excited we run toward the bush with hopeless abandon, and God has to call out and say, "Zach, stop! Take off your shoes, for you are standing on holy ground." Do you hear me? This stuff is contagious. This stuff disrupts our life. But here's the thing. We're loved. We're not alone in this. This work that is hard and that is difficult, look around. Look who you're sitting next to. Hold their hand and do it together. This work is not meant to be done alone, but it's meant to be done in relationship, in real, authentic, vulnerable communities of Christ. For the love of God, and I mean it literally, for the love of God, walk out these doors tonight and be forever transformed. Be willing to put your phone in your pocket, put your game system down, turn to the side, and recognize God. What is God up to in your life? Stop being so afraid of it. Stop being so worried about it. And begin to be willing to be vulnerable so that for the love of God, you can be a courageous disciple of Jesus Christ. Amen.